I landed after a 16-hour flight, craving silence. Instead, an orange foreclosure sign defaced the lawn of my fully paid-off estate. The absurdity was my home had zero debt. 10 minutes later, I found a $4.8 million mortgage bearing my flawlessly forged signature. The money flowed directly into my parents' joint account. They assumed I would quietly pay to save face. They didn't realize they just attacked an untouchable asset structure. My name is Mara Whitlock. At 38 years old, as an Irish-American woman operating at the apex of a brutally male-dominated industry, I had constructed my entire existence upon the unyielding, uncompromising foundation of absolute control. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vesper Meridian Freight Systems, though everyone in the boardroom simply calls it VMFS. We build the invisible infrastructure of the modern world. We manage logistics, orchestrate global supply chains, and move mountains of steel, concrete, and capital across oceans and continents. In my world, control is not merely a desirable personality trait, it is the sole currency that matters. You either dictate the terms of the system, or you are crushed by its gears. After a grueling 16-hour flight back from a European acquisition tour, my body was vibrating with that specific, hollow exhaustion that only sets in after you cross a dozen time zones while constantly negotiating contracts. Sitting in the back of the black luxury sedan, as it carved its way through the quiet, winding, forested roads of suburban Virginia, I was entirely drained. The relentless noise of the corporate battlefield was fading, replaced by a profound craving for total silence. I was ready to shut the world out completely. My ultimate sanctuary was Stonewake Estate. I bought it entirely in cash. Every slate roof tile, every ancient oak tree, every square inch of the sprawling grounds belonged exclusively to me, free and clear of any external leverage. The heavy wrought iron gates of Stonewake parted seamlessly. Recognizing the signal from my approaching vehicle, the thick gravel crunched rhythmically under the heavy tires. The manicured landscape lining the private drive stood like silent, loyal sentinels in the fading, slate-gray light of the late afternoon. The physical environment was flawless. It was exactly as I had left it. I dismissed my driver at the circular turnaround, dragging my heavy leather overnight bag out of the trunk myself. The crisp Virginia air bit sharply at my cheeks, waking up my tired senses. I turned my body toward the grand stone steps of the main portico, deeply anticipating the heavy, satisfying click of the deadbolt and the perfect, isolated silence of my foyer. That was the precise moment the illusion of safety shattered. It was an obscenity of neon orange plastic and galvanized steel wire, violently stabbed right into the pristine, emerald green lawn, just inches from the first step of my porch. A foreclosure sale sign, a public auction notice. For a fraction of a second, a primal, hot spike of adrenaline slammed directly into the center of my chest. It was a purely physical punch that actually stole the breath from my lungs and caused the blood to roar in my ears. But that visceral shock lasted less than a heartbeat. Then, the ice took over. The fiery Irish temper my father always warned me about did not ignite. It froze absolutely solid. I stepped closer, my sharp heels sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth of the flower bed, and read the bold, aggressive black lettering. The property was slated for public auction. The lender driving the action was Harbor Dominion Bank. Directly below the name of the bank was a long, complex, alphanumeric file number, followed immediately by the contact information for the County Sheriff's Civil Division. The most glaring, urgent piece of information was the date stamped at the bottom. The public auction was scheduled to happen in exactly 12 days. Normal people would panic. A normal homeowner would scream, drop to their knees in despair, or furiously dial the contact number printed on the plastic sign, begging a faceless customer service representative for mercy or an explanation. I am not a normal person. You do not build and sustain a billion-dollar logistics empire by reacting to sudden crises with raw, uncontrolled emotion. You manage catastrophes by instantly identifying the structural failure. Staring at that orange plastic, I did not see an existential threat to my home. I saw a catastrophic data discrepancy. It was a critical bug manifesting in my personal financial infrastructure. Stonewake Estate carried zero debt. There was no mortgage, no revolving line of credit, no outstanding mechanic lien. The mathematics of a foreclosure were literally impossible. Therefore, the sign was merely a symptom of a systemic error, and systemic errors required a rigorous, methodical audit. I turned away from the orange abomination, walked straight up the stone steps, and unlocked my heavy oak front door. I dropped my luggage right there on the expansive mahogany porch, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of clothing and electronics to the evening elements without a single second thought. The interior of the house was tomb silent, bathed in the cool, deepening shadows of the late afternoon. I ignored the sprawling chef kitchen, ignored the luxurious master suite upstairs, and walked with measured, deliberate, heavy steps straight down the long corridor to my private study. The study was my true fortress, a vault constructed of dark walnut paneling and thick, soundproofed glass. I bypassed the decorative antique writing desk in the center of the room and sat directly in front of my secure, multi-monitor workstation built into the far wall. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision, entering complex alphanumeric passphrases and executing biometric verifications. The three large monitors flared to life simultaneously, casting a stark, blindingly white glow across my cold face. I bypassed my heavily encrypted corporate networks and navigated straight to the open, public portals of the County Land Records Office. I did not want summaries or customer service platitudes. I needed raw, unfiltered, legally binding data. The government search interface was archaic and clunky, a frustrating relic of slow bureaucracy. I typed in the specific parcel identification number for Stonewake Estate. I needed to see the entire chain of title, from the moment I took possession to the present second. The system took an agonizing 10 seconds to query the database, the loading icons spinning like a deliberate taunt on the screen. Finally, the historical ledger populated on my right monitor. I scrolled all the way back to the genesis of my ownership. There it was, resting exactly where it should be, the original deed of sale. I opened the scan. It clearly and definitively displayed my all-cash purchase. The legal document explicitly stated that the property was transferred completely free and clear of any encumbrances. No debt, 100% equity. I exhaled a slow, heavily controlled breath through my nose. The historical foundation was solid. The reality I knew was documented fact. Keeping my hand perfectly steady on the mouse, I began scrolling up, tracing the timeline forward from that date of purchase. For years, the record remained beautifully clean. There were just routine annual tax assessments, all showing as paid in full and paid on time. Then, my eyes caught a new, jarring entry near the very top of the list. It was a massive, glaring block of administrative text that absolutely did not belong anywhere in my property history. My resting pulse remained steady, but the ambient air in the soundproofed room suddenly felt dangerously thin and cold. I clicked the blue hyperlink to open the scanned document. It was a deed of trust. It was a massive mortgage instrument. The loan amount printed on the first page was staggering, $4.8 million. I looked closely at the execution date stamped by the clerk. It had been registered exactly 10 months ago, while I was actively on the West Coast, aggressively negotiating a massive warehouse expansion for my company. Someone was quietly and legally encumbering my private sanctuary. I scanned through the rigid, dense legal boilerplate, my eyes rapidly searching for the borrower designation. I skipped past the lender terms and found the final signature page. The borrower listed, the person who had supposedly pledged my entirely paid-off estate as collateral for a nearly $5 million cash injection, was printed in clear, undeniable black ink. The name on the line was Mara Whitlock. I enlarged the high-resolution scan on my primary monitor, pushing the zoom level to 200%. The document filled the screen, a sprawling landscape of legal landmines. The Harbor Dominion Bank logo sat in the top left corner, crisp and arrogant. I bypassed the standard indemnification clauses, the default covenants, and the variable interest rate indices. Those were just standard operating procedures, the heavy machinery of institutional lending. I was hunting for the specific lever someone pulled to activate this machinery against me. I needed the anatomy of the lie. I scrolled past page after page of boilerplate text until I reached the final execution section. The ink was captured in stark, high-contrast grayscale against the white digital background. It was my name, sprawling across the designated borrower line. The loops of the first initial and the sharp, aggressive angles of the last were structurally accurate. To a low-level clerk or an automated optical character recognition system, it would pass without a second glance. But as I stared at the pixelated edges of the strokes, the anomaly revealed itself with glaring clarity. It was far too perfect, my actual signature, forged by years of authorizing thousands of freight manifests, corporate resolutions, and multi-million-dollar vendor contracts, is a product of chaotic velocity. It is rushed. It trails off into a sharp, almost violent flick of the pen. It carries the kinetic energy of someone who does not have time to dwell on the act of signing. This signature on the screen lacked any of that velocity. The stroke weight was entirely uniform from the start of the first letter to the end of the last. There were microscopic hesitations, tiny pools of ink where the pen had lingered just a fraction of a second too long at the apex of a curve. It was not signed. It was carefully, painstakingly drawn. It was a highly rehearsed reproduction. Only someone who had lived with me, who had spent hours sitting at a quiet table tracing my handwriting over and over again, could produce something so meticulously dead. Yet, a well-drawn forgery alone rarely clears the desk of a modern underwriter for a transaction approaching $5 million. Banks build massive walls of compliance. They needed a legitimate key to bypass the gate. My eyes tracked down to the lower left quadrant of the signature page. There it was, typed in a sterile, standard font, executed under power of attorney. Right next to that sentence sat the digital imprint of a notary public seal. A local Virginia commissioner of oaths had stamped and verified the transaction. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, pulling a memory from the dark archives of my past. 7 years ago, during the aggressive expansion phase of my first logistics hub, I suffered a severely ruptured appendix. It resulted in emergency surgery and a brief, heavy stint on intravenous painkillers. Because I ran a tightly controlled operation and could not afford to let the business stall while I was unconscious, I had my corporate counsel draft a power of attorney. It was an incredibly restrictive, profoundly narrow legal instrument. It granted my parents temporary authority to handle immediate medical billing disputes and sign one specific quarterly tax extension on my behalf. That was the absolute, hard-coded limit of their mandate. The document explicitly and aggressively forbade the encumbrance, sale, or transfer of any real property. Furthermore, that document was legally dead. It had been dead for years. I minimized the county property database and opened a secured, encrypted tunnel directly to the digital vault maintained by my private attorney. I navigated through the complex directory tree, moving through personal legal files, archival records, and finally into the revocations folder. I pulled up the scanned affidavit. It was signed, notarized, and legally recorded exactly 6 years and 9 months ago. The power of attorney was formally, officially dissolved. The document they used to secure this massive loan was a legal corpse, deliberately resurrected to commit a felony. I needed to see the current status of the bleeding. I copied the 13-digit alphanumeric loan identification number from the top right corner of the deed of trust. I opened a new browser window and navigated to the public-facing client portal of Harbor Dominion Bank. Like most major lenders, they offered a guest payment gateway where a user could check a basic balance by entering the loan number and the property zip code. I entered both pieces of data. The system authenticated the request, taking a painfully slow 5 seconds to load. When the dashboard finally rendered on my screen, it was bathed in angry, urgent red warning banners. The account was severely delinquent. The history showed 7 consecutive months of completely missed payments. Late fees were aggressively compounding upon late fees, creating a death spiral of penalty interest. No one had even attempted to service the debt since the initial funding. The automated risk management system of the bank had simply hit a predetermined critical threshold and coldly triggered the public auction protocol. But where did the initial capital go? I needed the disbursement ledger. The guest portal would never show that level of detail. So I returned to the county records and opened the title company settlement statement attached to the final recording of the deed. Page 4 detailed the exact flow of funds at the closing table. I traced the lines of the spreadsheet. $0 were routed to my personal checking accounts. $0 were routed to the operating accounts of Vesper Meridian Freight Systems. The entire $4.8 million, minus minor closing costs, appraisal fees, and loan origination charges, had been consolidated into a single, massive outgoing wire transfer. I tracked the routing number and the destination account beneficiary listed on the settlement sheet. The text was small, printed in a dull, bureaucratic font, but the letters burned themselves into my retinas. The beneficiaries of the wire transfer were Warren and Judith Whitlock, my father and my mother. I reached over and hit the print command on my keyboard. The heavy commercial-grade laser printer sitting in the corner of my soundproofed study immediately hummed to life. It methodically spat out page after page of high-definition evidence. I captured wide screenshots of the delinquent bank dashboard, the unnaturally perfect forged signature, the legally dead power of attorney revocation, and the damning wire transfer log. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and laid them out in a perfectly aligned grid across the expansive dark walnut surface of my desk. I stood over them, analyzing the entire picture. The silence in the room was absolute, perfectly matching the absolute zero temperature that had settled permanently in my chest. This was not a tragic case of desperate family members quietly borrowing money from a successful daughter in a moment of weakness. You do not accidentally bypass a rigorous corporate title search using a revoked, highly restricted legal instrument. You do not accidentally forge a signature with this level of practiced, chilling precision. You do not accidentally route millions of dollars across state lines into a private joint account while leaving the victim to face the automated wrath of a bank. This was a calculated, coordinated strike. This was predatory behavior executed with terrifying efficiency. My parents had not just stolen from me, they had weaponized my own identity against my sanctuary. I was looking at undeniable, documented proof of organized mortgage fraud. I reached across the expanse of my desk and picked up my personal communication device. I deliberately bypassed the local police precinct contact saved in my emergency directory. Instead, I tapped my mother's name. The line trilled twice before she answered. "Mara, darling." Her voice floated through the high-fidelity speaker, dripping with that manufactured, sugary warmth she always deployed when she was attempting to manage my mood. "Are you back from your European trip already?" "I am standing inside my private study," I stated, keeping my vocal cords perfectly relaxed, pitching my voice flat, low, and devoid of any relational warmth. "I am currently looking at a public auction notice planted aggressively in my front yard. I am also looking at a routing confirmation for a $4.8 million wire transfer deposited directly into the primary joint checking account you share with Dad." The line went completely dead. It was not a brief, conversational pause. It was exactly 3 minutes of heavy, suffocating, absolute silence. I did not prompt her. I did not ask if she was still there. I let the crushing weight of my statement fill the digital airspace between us. I listened to the faint, shallow sound of her breathing. When she finally inhaled deeply to speak, the sugary maternal warmth had entirely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a rigid, defensive, and sharply guarded tone. "We need to discuss this situation properly. Mara," she clipped, her voice tight. "You and Warren have exactly 45 minutes to get to my house," I replied, and immediately terminated the connection. They arrived in exactly 32 minutes. I remained seated, watching through the reinforced glass of my study window as a pristine, custom-ordered European sport utility vehicle glided smoothly up my driveway. The gleaming machine easily cleared $180,000 retail. It was a rolling monument to sudden, unearned wealth. My father stepped out first. He was draped in a tailored, heavy cashmere overcoat that absolutely did not exist in his wardrobe 12 months ago. Judith emerged from the passenger side, casually adjusting a thick, dazzling diamond tennis bracelet that caught and fractured the fading evening light. As they walked up the steps, they did not look like two people caught executing a massive financial crime. Their posture lacked any of the nervous tension or shame characteristic of the guilty. Instead, they looked radiant. They looked like lottery winners arriving to collect their oversized check. When they pushed open the heavy oak door and entered my workspace, neither of them displayed a single fraction of a heartbeat of remorse. They walked into my sanctuary with the brazen, relaxed, and deeply entitled posture of activist shareholders demanding their quarterly dividends. Warren settled his tall frame into the leather guest chair opposite my workstation, crossing one leg over his knee, casually smoothing the sharp crease of his tailored trousers. Judith remained standing, her eyes briefly and coldly appraising the printed forensic evidence I had laid out across my desk before she offered a dismissive, theatrical little sigh. "There is absolutely no need for this dramatic, hostile posture, Mara," Warren began. His tone was infuriatingly steady. It was laced with the condescending patience of a seasoned senior executive explaining basic macroeconomic principles to a particularly slow intern. "What you are looking at on those papers is simply a strategic reallocation of idle equity. I was managing a highly sensitive, premium resort development project on the coast. We hit an unexpected, temporary liquidity crisis due to supply chain issues. The contractors needed immediate capital to keep the heavy machinery moving, and traditional commercial lending pathways were simply moving too slowly to meet the deadlines. I merely borrowed against an asset that was sitting entirely dormant." "You borrowed." I repeated the specific word, draining my voice of all remaining emotion, turning it into a flat echo. "Exactly," Judith chimed in, stepping closer to the workstation and tapping a freshly manicured finger against the edge of the wood. "You really have to look at the bigger picture here. Darling, you generate a staggering amount of revenue every single fiscal year. For a logistics company the size of yours, $4.8 million is barely a rounding error on a balance sheet. You will hardly even notice that amount missing from your personal portfolio. We gave you life. We raised you. Ensuring your own family remains financially solvent during a brief market correction is just basic, unspoken filial duty." I looked at the two of them, studying their faces. The absolute, unvarnished arrogance was almost mesmerizing in its pure, toxic perfection. They had genuinely deeply convinced themselves that my hard-earned wealth was their divine, undeniable right. They had rationalized grand larceny into an act of parental entitlement. "Let us strip away the creative corporate vocabulary," I said, locking my eyes directly onto my father. "What you executed was not a strategic reallocation of equity. It was a highly coordinated wire fraud. It was criminal impersonation. You fabricated a signature on binding legal documents. You manipulated a legally void medical mandate to actively bypass institutional security measures. Those are severe state and federal offenses carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences." Warren did not flinch. He actually chuckled. It was a dry, grating, highly confident sound that scraped against the quiet acoustic paneling of the room. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, physically shifting from a relaxed, defensive posture into a calculated offensive strike. "You are throwing around very large, very scary legal terms, Mara," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, a predatory glint catching the monitor light. "But you are completely missing the practical, operational reality of the situation. The bank does not care about our internal family dynamics. Harbor Dominion does not care who held the pen. The compliance department only cares that the asset is collateralized and the account is hundreds of days delinquent. They want their capital back, with compounding interest, and they possessed the legal mechanism to take this property to get it. He was correct about one specific institutional truth. The financial machinery was entirely indifferent to the moral failing of the actors involved, but his supreme confidence was built upon a massive, foundational miscalculation of leverage. "And what exactly is your proposed solution to this practical reality?" I asked, keeping my facial muscles locked into a blank, unreadable mask. Judith smiled, a tight, cold, and victorious stretching of her lips. "The solution is entirely straightforward. You pay off the outstanding balance tomorrow morning. You clear the massive arrears, you satisfy the principal amount, and the lender immediately removes that ugly public notice from your lawn. Your precious, quiet estate goes back to being unencumbered, and we all move forward with our lives." Warren nodded in slow agreement, preparing to deliver the final, heavily calculated blow he truly believed would permanently checkmate me. "Your annual investor summit and your critical quarterly earnings report are scheduled for exactly 14 days from now," Warren stated, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, absolute certainty. "The financial press will be scrutinizing every single detail of your life and your corporate governance. If this property goes to public auction, if a highly visible, self-made chief executive officer is suddenly publicly evicted for defaulting on a massive, multi-million-dollar loan, the optics will completely destroy your share price. The board of directors will demand your immediate resignation to protect the brand equity. You cannot afford a personal scandal. Mara, we both know you will write the check because protecting your empire is the only thing you actually care about." They sat back in the dim room, fully and completely believing they had backed me into a completely inescapable corner. They thought they had perfectly weaponized my own relentless success against me. They were using my corporate reputation and my pathological need for absolute control as the very chains to bind my hands. They fully expected me to rage, to threaten, to scream, and then, ultimately, to surrender and silently wire the millions to protect my public image. I kept my hands resting lightly on the cool surface of my desk. I did not blink. I just watched them bask in their perceived, unassailable victory. I carefully cataloged their supreme, blinding confidence. They had absolutely no idea that their fatal, catastrophic error had nothing to do with the sum of money they had stolen. The air in my soundproofed study felt heavy with their misplaced, suffocating triumph. Warren and Judith were completely oblivious to the tectonic plates violently shifting beneath their feet. They were operating on entirely outdated intelligence, arrogantly assuming the battlefield was the exact same one I had purchased all those years ago. But my empire had aggressively evolved, and my personal assets had been heavily, legally fortified in ways they could not even begin to comprehend. Exactly 18 months prior to this evening, during a comprehensive risk mitigation overhaul of my entire private portfolio, I fundamentally altered the foundational ownership structure of this property. I did not simply own this land under my given individual name anymore. I had legally conveyed the entirety of the estate into the Stonewake Residential Trust. I installed a fiercely independent, highly aggressive corporate trustee based in a completely different jurisdiction to manage it. I retained a long-term, irrevocable right of occupancy, shielding my physical sanctuary from any direct personal liability or hostile external attachments. Furthermore, the physical estate was no longer a single, contiguous legal entity, working with a team of specialized land use attorneys. I had partitioned the acreage into 3 highly distinct, isolated parcels. Parcel A contained the primary residence, the immediate surrounding manicured gardens, and the security perimeter. Parcel B was exclusively the winding private access road connecting my gates to the county highway. Parcel C was an undeveloped, heavily wooded auxiliary strip running parallel to the front boundary line. If you merely glanced at a publicly aggregated, simplified tax database, it might still look like one large, unified block of land. But an actual, rigorous examination of the county deed registry would reveal a complex, deliberately fragmented legal labyrinth. That was the glaring, catastrophic flaw in their supposedly flawless victory. A standard, automated banking underwriting system might blindly accept a meticulously forged signature. But a commercial title insurance company, an entity strictly required to legally guarantee a multi-million-dollar loan, absolutely does not miss a blind trust and a three-way parcel subdivision. The title search is the bedrock of all real estate lending. If they had run a legitimate, required title search, the system would have immediately flagged that Mara Whitlock no longer held fee simple absolute title to pledge the main domicile as collateral. The fraudulent loan should have died instantly on the underwriter desk. I leaned back slightly in my heavy leather chair, letting my shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, perfectly simulating the physical deflation of an utterly defeated executive. I kept my voice incredibly low, injecting just enough hesitant, reluctant curiosity to feed my father's overwhelming, blinding ego. I am trying to understand the mechanical reality of your transaction. Warren, I said softly, stripping away any trace of my earlier hostility. The underwriting process for a capital injection of that immense magnitude is brutally, relentlessly thorough. Who exactly did you retain to conduct the municipal title search? How did you possibly manage to clear the rigorous institutional compliance hurdles using historical, outdated property records? Warren practically beamed in the dim light of the monitors. He completely mistook my tactical inquiry for genuine professional admiration. He adjusted his heavy cashmere coat, looking incredibly pleased with his own perceived brilliance. You are not the only person in this family who understands how to navigate the complex financial sector. Mara, he boasted, his voice thick with unearned pride and profound ignorance. You do not need a rigorous, third-party municipal audit when you have cultivated the right personal relationships. We bypass the standard, sluggish bureaucratic red tape. I have a very understanding associate inside Harbor Dominion Bank, a senior regional relationship manager who respects discretion and understands the overarching vision of my coastal project. He personally expedited the internal review process. He assured me the historical data on file was perfectly sufficient for a quiet, private bridge loan between family members. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Though my face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of dull resignation. There it was, the golden thread. This was not a desperate, sloppy cash grab by two aging parents who stumbled upon a forgotten legal document. This was a highly organized, institutional inside job. My parents provided the forged documents and the stolen identity. A corrupt local notary provided the false legal seal. And a compromised senior executive inside Harbor Dominion Bank deliberately disabled the mandatory institutional alarms, pushing the fraudulent capital through the system while intentionally bypassing the absolute requirement of a title verification. Another crucial, hidden detail suddenly locked violently into place in my mind. I mentally replayed my exhausting walk up the gravel driveway. The aggressive neon orange public auction notice was stabbed directly into the manicured lawn of the main portico. But when I was reviewing the digital scan of the fraudulent deed of trust on my workstation, the attached legal description of the pledged collateral had looked slightly, strangely off. I realized exactly what I had seen. The metes and bounds described on their fake mortgage document did not match Parcel A, the main house, because the bank insider was working with outdated, unverified system data to force the loan through. They had accidentally attached the massive lien to Parcel C, the entirely worthless, undeveloped auxiliary strip of dirt near the front gate. The third-party foreclosure agent had simply driven up to the main house and planted the sign in the most visible spot, entirely unaware they were legally threatening the wrong plot of land. The realization washed over me with absolute, crystal clarity. If I surrendered right now, if I simply transferred the millions tomorrow morning to make the problem vanish before my quarterly earnings report, my parents would walk away wealthy and unpunished. The corrupt notary would keep their illegal kickback. The bank insider would erase his digital footprints, secure his unearned commission, and hunt for the next vulnerable, high net worth account. And worse, if I immediately called my corporate counsel right this second and unleashed a massive legal injunction to publicly squash the foreclosure, the bank would instantly go into a severe defensive lockdown. The massive institution would bury the internal compliance breach deep beneath mountains of corporate lawyers to protect their own stock price, claiming it was merely a clerical error. The insider would survive, hidden within the corporate machinery. I could save my house with one single phone call, but I would lose the ultimate war. I needed to rip the entire syndicate out by the bleeding roots. I needed to publicly expose the bank, completely destroy the insider, and permanently, ruthlessly neutralize my parents' ability to ever threaten my empire again. To execute that level of destruction, I absolutely could not hit the panic button. I had to make them feel entirely, warmly safe. I had to build a meticulously structured, multi-layered psychological and legal trap. I needed them to freely speak, to willingly sign new, damning documents, and to arrogantly expose the man protecting them from the inside. I looked at the two people sitting comfortably in my sanctuary. Two people who genuinely believed they held my entire life and legacy in their hands. I took a slow, measured breath, preparing to hand them the very shovel they would use to dig their own inescapable graves. I let a heavy, agonizingly slow sigh escape my lips, deliberately shattering the tense, combative atmosphere that had dominated the room. I dropped my gaze from my father's arrogant stare to the perfectly polished, dark walnut surface of my desk. I allowed my shoulders to physically sag, collapsing the rigid, aggressive posture of a corporate chief executive and carefully adopting the defeated, exhausted body language of a completely cornered daughter. The psychological chess match required a sacrifice, and I was perfectly willing to offer them the illusion of my total surrender. "You understand," I began, pitching my voice significantly lower, infusing my words with a meticulously manufactured tremor of genuine, desperate anxiety. "That if the board of directors catches even a faint whisper of a public default attached to my primary residence, the fallout will be instantly catastrophic. The institutional investors are currently hypersensitive to any signs of executive instability. A multi-million-dollar foreclosure, even if we privately know it is a manufactured crisis, signals severe, uncontrolled personal financial distress. They would immediately trigger the morality and stability clauses in my operating contract. They would initiate a vote of no confidence before the end of the fiscal quarter." Warren slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, the predatory gleam burning brightly in his eyes. He smelled the blood in the water. He truly believed he had successfully broken my defenses. "Exactly," he murmured smoothly, his voice dropping into a patronizing, soothing cadence. "Which is precisely why we brought this urgent matter to your attention before the public auction actually takes place. You have the immense resources required to extinguish this minor spark before it burns down your entire corporate forest. You just need to act decisively." I shook my head slowly, raising my hands to rub my temples as if fighting a massive, blinding migraine. "It is absolutely not that simple, Warren. My staggering net worth is largely theoretical at this specific moment in the fiscal year. Almost all of my liquid capital is aggressively locked up in escrow accounts for the massive Midwestern logistics hub expansion we are acquiring. To pull millions of dollars out immediately, I have to rapidly liquidate restricted stock options or deliberately break severe penalty clauses on short-term corporate bonds. I need time to discreetly maneuver the liquidity through international holding accounts without setting off internal auditing alarms and tipping off my own chief financial officer." He waved his hand dismissively through the air, his heavy gold signet ring catching the harsh light from my computer monitors. "Business is always about finding the hidden leverage, my dear. Consider this a highly valuable, practical lesson in advanced crisis management. You will find the capital because your professional survival entirely depends on it." He stood up, pacing a few steps across the thick Persian rug, physically dominating the space in my sanctuary. "But let me be absolutely, unequivocally clear regarding the parameters of this resolution. You do not involve your external corporate counsel. You do not initiate any contact whatsoever with Harbor Dominion Bank. If you trigger a panic within their compliance division, my associate might be forced to protect himself, and the entire file goes straight to their hostile asset recovery unit. You simply initiate a direct silent wire transfer to satisfy the outstanding ledger. We keep this strictly contained within the family. Judith stepped forward, her face contorting into a sickening mask of grotesque, manufactured maternal sympathy. She reached across the expanse of the desk, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking softly against the polished wood, and lightly patted my folded, seemingly trembling hands. "We are fundamentally not unreasonable people, darling," she cooed, her voice practically dripping with synthetic, toxic honey. "We know this is a terribly stressful temporary inconvenience for you. To legally prove our incredibly good faith, once you clear the immediate banking hurdle and save your home, your father and I are perfectly willing to draft a formal promissory note. We will sign a binding agreement to slowly, steadily reimburse you from the massive future profits of the coastal resort project." It was a brilliantly insulting, completely delusional concession. She was essentially offering to repay stolen millions using a completely unsecured, legally toothless promise backed only by the theoretical future revenue of a real estate venture that was currently drowning in catastrophic debt. I kept my eyes downcast, perfectly executing the role of the reluctant victim accepting a terrible, unavoidable extortion deal. "Fine," I whispered, projecting total, crushing defeat into the silent room. "I need exactly 7 days to maneuver the funds through various shell accounts to completely avoid any corporate scrutiny. We will finalize this internal family repayment agreement here, sitting at this exact desk, 1 week from tonight." I looked up, meeting my father's gaze with feigned, desperate vulnerability. "But if I am going to drain my critical emergency reserves to save this estate, I need absolute, documented, undeniable assurance that this coastal project is actually economically viable. I need you to bring every single piece of financial documentation next week. The foundational operating agreements, the limited liability company formation documents, the primary contractor ledgers, the architectural retainer receipts, and the last 6 months of certified banking statements for every single entity involved in that resort. I cannot write a blank check blindly to a black hole. I need to see exactly where my capital is going to be generated for this supposed reimbursement." Warren smiled broadly, a wide, arrogant expression of pure, unadulterated victory. He completely believed I was desperately trying to salvage my bruised ego and establish a tiny shred of control by demanding administrative paperwork. "Done. I will bring the entire investment portfolio. You will finally see the massive scale of my vision." They turned in unison toward the heavy oak door, their posture radiating triumphant, arrogant energy. Just as Warren gripped the solid brass handle to leave, I spoke up, injecting a tone of mild, exhausted, entirely casual curiosity into the quiet space. "That is quite an impressive upgrade sitting in the driveway," I noted softly. "And I noticed some rather picturesque, incredibly expensive-looking ocean views on your social media feed recently. A new condominium?" Judith absolutely could not resist the glittering opportunity to gloat. The psychological trap was so perfectly, seamlessly laid that she dove into it headfirst. She practically vibrated with the desperate, pathetic need to validate her new, entirely stolen social status. "Oh, the luxury sport utility vehicle was an absolute, fundamental necessity for properly entertaining high-net-worth investors," she boasted loudly, her voice echoing sharply down the long hallway. "And the sprawling penthouse in Boca Raton is simply our brand-new seasonal base of operations. The developers gave us a magnificent, highly exclusive pre-market deal. It requires some incredibly extensive, costly remodeling, but the custom Italian marble we just imported for the foyer is simply breathtaking." I listened intently to the heavy thud of the front door closing, followed shortly by the distant, muffled, powerful roar of their highly expensive engine coming to life and rapidly fading down the long gravel driveway. The very instant the sound completely vanished into the Virginia night, the slumped posture of the defeated, broken daughter evaporated into thin air. My spine snapped perfectly, rigidly straight. My breathing instantly normalized into a slow, highly controlled rhythm. The cold, calculating, ruthless machinery of my mind kicked violently back into high gear. They had just gleefully handed me exactly what I needed. They were going to walk back into this highly secure room in exactly 7 days, voluntarily carrying a comprehensive, fully documented paper trail of their entire money laundering operation. I stood up, walked deliberately to the heavy oak door, and slid the solid brass deadbolt into place with a definitive, satisfying, metallic click. I walked back to my workstation, completely ignoring my primary, easily traceable mobile device. Instead, I unlocked the reinforced bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a secondary, heavily encrypted communication device I maintained strictly for catastrophic corporate espionage contingencies. I dialed a highly specific, unlisted number I had memorized long ago. I was absolutely not calling the local police department. Standard law enforcement would clumsily blunder into the regional bank branch, instantly tip off the inside man, and irrevocably destroy the fragile. Complex web of digital evidence. I needed a predator, not a patrolman. The secure line connected on the very first ring. I require your immediate, fully covert deployment, I said into the encrypted receiver. My voice once again entirely stripped of all human emotion, pure absolute zero. I am staring down a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar title fraud attack directed at a fortified residential trust. And we have a confirmed, highly active hostile actor currently operating safely inside the senior regional management tier of the lending institution. By 2 o'clock the following afternoon, my soundproofed private study had been completely transformed from a solitary executive sanctuary into a highly classified, fully operational war room. This was not a chaotic scramble for survival. This was a meticulously orchestrated reverse heist. Instead of assembling a crew to break into a vault and steal capital, I had assembled a specialized strike team to systematically break into a digital fortress and steal undeniable truth. Every single piece of evidence we extracted was a weapon carefully loaded into the chamber. The team was small, intensely loyal, and absolutely lethal in their respective fields. Rachel Keene was a relentless title litigation attorney whose court filings were constructed like precision military strikes. Marcus Bell was a brilliant forensic accountant who viewed complex financial ledgers not as boring spreadsheets, but as living, breathing ecosystems of human greed and vulnerability. Rounding out the triad was Elena Torres, my chief internal risk advisor at Vesper Meridian Freight Systems, a woman whose entire career was dedicated to quietly suffocating corporate fires long before the smoke ever reached the public ventilation systems. I stood at the head of the heavy walnut desk, the three of them arrayed before the glowing multi-screen workstation. Rule number 1, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the acoustic paneling, establishing the absolute perimeter of our operation. Under no circumstances does any inquiry, digital ping, or legal preservation notice reach any local or regional branch of Harbor Dominion Bank. We are operating under the verified assumption that a senior executive within their commercial lending division actively facilitated this massive breach. If that insider smells a forensic audit approaching, they will immediately trigger a catastrophic error protocol, shred the digital trail, and completely sever their ties with my parents to protect the institution and their own freedom. Rachel nodded, her eyes already darting between the dual screens where she had pulled up the municipal county index side by side with the updated state property registry. You are entirely correct about the internal manipulation. Mara, she noted, her tone sharp and analytical. I spent the morning dissecting the chain of title. Look at the digital timestamps on the municipal recording. The standard underwriting procedure requires a strict, sequential, chronological verification process, but the registry shows the property title was queried, locked, and then aggressively, manually overridden. The massive lien was forcibly attached to Parcel C, your worthless dirt strip, a full 48 hours before the title commitment was theoretically finalized. Someone with high-level administrative credentials deliberately paused the automated compliance review, shoved the fraudulent deed through the system, and backdated the final approval. Marcus pushed his thick glasses up the bridge of his nose, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard of his heavily encrypted laptop. And the massive financial incentive for committing that level of career suicide is currently scattered across the eastern seaboard. I have spent the last 12 hours aggressively tracing the disbursement of the $4.8 million. It did not simply sit dormant in their primary joint checking account. Warren immediately initiated a complex, highly aggressive series of cascading wire transfers designed to rapidly wash the capital. Marcus hit a key, projecting his intricate financial map onto the main wall monitor. He moved $1.5 million directly into a newly formed, completely opaque limited liability company registered in Delaware. He then bled another $800,000 to aggressively settle high-interest personal debts, clear a massive arrears at an exclusive regional country club, and outright purchase the European luxury vehicle you saw parked in your driveway yesterday. The largest chunk, roughly $2 million, was wired as a non-refundable, heavy cash deposit to a commercial real estate developer in Florida to secure his position in a massive, failing coastal resort project. Elena did not look at the glowing monitors. She kept her eyes locked directly on me, her expression grim. While they are spending your stolen capital, Judith is already laying the groundwork for a massive public relations offensive, she warned quietly. My intelligence algorithms flagged highly anomalous chatter on several elite financial gossip networks late last night. There are blind items currently circulating about a prominent female logistics executive secretly using corporate assets to fund a lavish personal lifestyle while simultaneously defaulting on massive private debts. They are actively trying to build a public narrative that you are financially unstable, setting you up to look like a desperate villain if you attempt to legally evict them. Therefore, I have preemptively constructed an impenetrable reputation shield. I have initiated an independent, third-party audit of every single Vesper Meridian account tied to your name. By Friday morning, we will possess an ironclad, legally binding certification proving that your corporate and personal assets are perfectly segregated and absolutely pristine. If they attempt to leverage the financial press against you, we will annihilate their public credibility in exactly 5 minutes. The financial mapping is brilliant, and the corporate shield is essential, Rachel interjected, holding up a freshly printed sheet of paper. But the criminal prosecution ultimately rests entirely on the execution of the forged documents. And this is exactly where their entire operation fatally collapses. I pulled the specific digital profile of the notary public who supposedly witnessed your father and mother sign the loan documents here in Virginia. Rachel smoothed the paper onto the desk. The notary seal explicitly swears, under penalty of severe perjury, that Warren and Judith Whitlock physically stood inside a Virginia office at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th of October to execute the deed. However, Elena Cross referenced this with external data. Elena tapped a key, bringing up a high-resolution video still on the monitor. The metadata embedded in this file is legally indisputable. At exactly 3:30 on the afternoon of the 14th, your parents were being actively photographed attending a lavish charity gala in a completely different time zone, over 800 miles away. It is physically, geographically impossible for them to have been standing in that Virginia notary office. Rachel leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the desk, her expression turning lethal. Which means the notarization was executed entirely electronically, without the physical presence of the signers, using a heavily compromised credential. I immediately filed an emergency, ex parte digital evidence preservation order targeting the software provider used by that specific notary. We quietly secured the server logs just an hour ago. Rachel paused, letting the immense weight of her next sentence settle deeply into the quiet room. The specific Internet Protocol address that accessed the notary portal and applied the digital seal to your perfectly forged signature did not originate from a local Virginia strip mall. The geolocation data maps the signal directly to a secure, private subnet. I looked at the complex string of numbers highlighted on the screen. Whose subnet? Harbor Dominion Bank, Rachel stated flatly, the undeniable truth ringing in the air. Specifically, the signal originated from a dedicated, highly secure server located on the executive floor of their regional private wealth management and commercial lending division. The room went entirely silent. The implications were staggering. This was no longer merely a tragic story of familial betrayal. "We actually have them," Marcus whispered, staring in awe at the undeniable digital fingerprint. "We have the entire structural architecture of the fraud." I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked slowly toward the glowing monitors. The lingering, dull ache of betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp, crystal-clear sense of absolute, terrifying control. The reverse heist was yielding spectacular, devastating returns. We were not stealing their money. We were systematically, surgically stealing their leverage, their secrets, and their very freedom. They did not just find a greedy teller or a rogue, low-level loan officer, I said, tracing the flow of the digital evidence on the screen with my finger. To completely override a commercial title lock, bypass the physical presence requirement for a multi-million-dollar collateral execution, and successfully run an electronic notary seal from a secure banking server, you need immense, unchecked administrative authority. You need someone who can silently kill the institutional risk alerts. A vice president, Elena concluded, her voice dark and absolute. A regional credit vice president or higher. The stakes had just exponentially escalated. The battle was no longer confined to the manicured lawns of Stonewake Estate. It was not a localized dispute over a forged family document. It was a massive, systemic, multi-million-dollar institutional fraud conspiracy. Harbor Dominion Bank was unknowingly harboring a highly toxic, criminal asset within their senior leadership structure, and my parents were tethered directly to him. "Rachel," I instructed, turning back to face my silent strike team, "begin preparing the foundational draft for a massive, multi-count federal racketeering lawsuit. Do not file it. Keep it completely dark. Marcus, continue aggressively mapping every single dime of that Florida resort investment. I want to know exactly who they owe money to down there. Elena, maintain the absolute perimeter on my corporate reputation." I looked at the three of them standing in the deep shadows of my sanctuary. In exactly 6 days, my parents are walking back into this room to sign what they arrogantly believe is a private, humiliating family repayment agreement. We are going to let them confidently construct their own gallows, and then we are going to invite the federal government to pull the lever. The following morning, the atmosphere inside my private study had shifted from cold analytical precision to a dark, suffocating realization that the conspiracy ran far deeper than simple familial greed. Marcus Bell, my forensic accountant, had barely slept. He stood by the main monitor, his eyes bloodshot behind his thick frames, staring at a newly generated, incredibly complex web of financial routing data. We were no longer simply tracking stolen capital. We were staring directly into a massive, collapsing financial sinkhole that my father had desperately tried to plug with my name. Marcus projected a dense corporate hierarchy chart onto the screen. It detailed the ownership structure of the Florida Coastal Resort project, where Warren had dumped the majority of the fraudulent wire transfer. The project was not merely struggling, it was completely dead in the water, drowning under the weight of severe gross mismanagement. But the true danger lay in the specific identities of his co-investors. Warren had not partnered with standard commercial developers. He had aggressively leveraged himself alongside a syndicate of highly connected local political figures, municipal zoning commissioners, and regional union bosses. These were not individuals who accepted standard bankruptcy filings with a polite handshake. They were ruthless operators. Marcus had uncovered a mountain of aggressively pending litigation. If that coastal project officially defaulted, Warren was not just going to lose his equity. He was facing an immediate, massive class action lawsuit from heavily armed contractors, furious political backers, and unpaid labor unions. They were preparing to completely strip him of every single asset he possessed and potentially push for severe criminal fraud charges against him in the state of Florida. He needed a massive injection of untraceable liquidity immediately, not to buy luxury vehicles, but to literally save himself from complete financial and legal annihilation. Marcus tapped a key, bringing up a highly incriminating, plain text email he had successfully extracted from a poorly secured corporate server associated with the Florida Development Group. The message was authored by my father, sent directly to the lead political investor just 3 weeks before the fraudulent mortgage was officially recorded against my property. I read the stark, black text glowing on the monitor. Warren had written, and I quote, that his daughter was the chief executive officer of a highly vulnerable logistics empire. He explicitly bragged to this corrupt syndicate that I would absolutely never dare to make a public scene regarding a quiet family loan, because I lived in absolute terror of triggering a massive shareholder panic. He assured them that I would silently absorb the multi-million-dollar debt to protect my corporate board from scandal. He had perfectly, precisely calculated my exact public vulnerability and actively weaponized my hard-earned professional reputation to guarantee his own survival. The sickening reality of his strategy settled into my chest, heavy and absolute. But the offensive did not end with my father. Elena Torres, my internal risk advisor, stepped forward, her tablet glowing with highly disturbing social media metrics and intercepted digital communications. While Warren was orchestrating the financial theft, Judith was serving as the architect of my total reputational assassination. Elena had spent the night aggressively auditing the dark corners of the financial gossip sphere. She uncovered a direct, ongoing line of communication between my mother and a highly toxic, extremely popular anonymous blogger who specialized in destroying the careers of prominent corporate executives. Judith was not merely gossiping. She was actively feeding this entity a meticulously crafted, entirely fabricated narrative. Elena pulled up a series of text message screenshots Judith had transmitted to the blogger. My mother had taken years of our private, highly mundane digital conversations and maliciously butchered them. She aggressively cropped out my responses, selectively stitching together isolated sentences to completely alter the context. She manufactured a horrifying digital script, portraying me as a deeply unstable, ungrateful daughter who was actively planning to violently evict her fragile, elderly parents onto the street just to inflate her own real estate portfolio. Furthermore, she was preparing to feed the blogger a completely fabricated story that my entirely self-made logistics empire was actually secretly funded by her and Warren, and that I had essentially stolen the company from them. Judith was building a catastrophic public relations bomb, holding her finger firmly on the detonator, fully intending to extort my silence by threatening to utterly destroy my personal legacy. The ground beneath me was continuously shifting. Every single truth we unearthed immediately ripped open a new, much darker chasm. They were not merely trying to steal my property. They were actively preparing to completely erase my identity and rewrite my history to cast me as a ruthless villain. Then, a sudden, sharp digital chime interrupted the heavy silence of the war room. Rachel Keene, my title litigation attorney, looked down at her encrypted mobile device. Her eyes widened slightly, a rare expression of genuine surprise crossing her usually stoic features. She immediately connected her device to the main screen, projecting a high-resolution photograph that completely altered our tactical legal advantage. For days, I had harbored a quiet, lingering suspicion regarding the chief groundskeeper of Stonewake Estate. I had briefly worried that he might have been financially compromised by my parents, bribed to casually look the other way and allow the foreclosure agent to breach the security gates and plant the ugly orange sign on my lawn. I was entirely wrong. His loyalty was absolute. The image on the screen was a photograph of the foreclosure sign, completely identical to the one I had found upon my return. But the critical element was the unalterable, encrypted digital timestamp embedded directly into the metadata of the image file. The groundskeeper had silently observed the aggressive agent planting the notice. Instead of confronting the man, he had calmly stepped out of the shadows, photographed the sign the very second it pierced the soil, and immediately forwarded the secure image directly to my corporate legal department for processing. Rachel pointed a sharp manicured finger at the glowing green timestamp on the monitor. The chronological implications were absolutely devastating for Harbor Dominion Bank. The timestamp definitively proved, down to the exact second, that the bank and their third-party foreclosure processing entity had aggressively mobilized their field agents, breached my private property, and publicly executed an enforcement action a full 48 hours before they had ever legally completed an updated, mandatory title verification. They had blindly fired their weapon without ever checking if the target was actually valid. In their desperate, sloppy rush to push the fraudulent default through the system and appease the corrupt regional vice president, the institutional machinery had completely violated strictly enforced federal consumer financial protection regulations. By jumping the gun and planting that sign based on entirely manipulated, unverified data, Harbor Dominion Bank had crossed a massive legal line. They were no longer merely the victim of my parents' forgery. They were now fully, legally culpable for the malicious initiation of a wrongful foreclosure and the deliberate, reckless endangerment of my corporate reputation. Rachel smiled, a sharp, incredibly dangerous expression. We now possessed the exact leverage required to utterly crush the bank's massive legal department before they could even attempt to bury the scandal. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my family's total betrayal. The initial, superficial panic regarding a potential property loss was completely gone. I understood with absolute, chilling clarity that this war was no longer about saving a parcel of land or satisfying a bank ledger. I did not care about the physical bricks of Stonewake Estate anymore. This was an existential battle to violently reclaim absolute control of my own narrative. If I hesitated for a single second, my parents would successfully transform me into a highly public, universally despised corporate monster. I had to strike first. I had to strike with overwhelming, catastrophic force, and I had to execute the destruction so publicly that no one would ever dare to manipulate my name again. I reviewed the 30-page document glowing on my primary monitor. To the untrained eye, or to a father blinded by his own staggering arrogance, the text read exactly like an unconditional surrender. I had instructed Rachel to draft a highly customized family repayment agreement that heavily favored Warren and Judith. The first 10 pages were saturated with submissive corporate legal jargon, explicitly outlining my total commitment to clear the entire multi-million-dollar mortgage balance before the public auction deadline. It guaranteed my parents a completely frictionless escape route from the financial disaster they had engineered. However, the true lethal payload was brilliantly concealed deep within the boilerplate indemnification clauses near the end of the document. Rachel had meticulously constructed a series of mandatory attestations. By signing this specific contract to receive their supposed future reimbursement, my parents would be legally swearing under penalty of perjury to several undeniable facts. They would have to acknowledge the exact original source of the funds, explicitly detail their specific use of the capital for the failing coastal resort, and formally name the internal financial broker who facilitated the transaction. Furthermore, they had to sign a declaration confirming that they acted entirely on their own accord, without any third-party coercion. It was not a settlement agreement. It was a perfectly formatted, legally binding, fully documented confession. I attached the encrypted file to an email and sent it directly to Warren. His response arrived less than 2 hours later. The sheer velocity of his reply exposed his desperate, ravenous greed. He did not simply agree to the terms. He demanded we accelerate the timeline. He proposed we meet 3 days earlier than originally planned. He suggested we convene in a private dining room at his newly acquired, highly exclusive country club, demanding I execute the massive wire transfer on my mobile device the very second the ink dried on the paper. I allowed a cold, sharp smile to touch my lips. I typed my counteroffer, perfectly matching his urgent tone with feigned paranoia. I informed him that executing a multi-million-dollar liquidity transfer in a semi-public country club was an absolute corporate security nightmare. I insisted that to ensure total, airtight confidentiality and prevent any potential leaks to the financial press, we had to execute the documents in a secure, controlled environment. I provided the address for the downtown office of the independent corporate trustee who technically held the deed to Stonewake Estate. I sold it to him as a neutral, highly secure, boring legal sanctuary. Warren immediately agreed. He had absolutely no idea that the specific conference room I had booked within that law firm was not merely secure, it was permanently wired with state-of-the-art, legally admissible, high-definition audio and video recording equipment, standard for complex corporate depositions. Every single word he spoke, every boast he made, and the exact moment his pen touched the paper would be captured from 3 different angles. While I was baiting the physical trap, my strike team was aggressively locking down the perimeter in total darkness. Rachel spent the entire afternoon quietly navigating the labyrinthine back channels of the federal courthouse. She successfully filed a highly classified temporary digital evidence seal, legally locking down the compromised notary server logs and the manipulated title registry queries we had extracted. She also meticulously prepared an emergency, ex parte injunction specifically designed to instantly halt the public auction, but she kept the final, devastating document completely unfiled, holding it back like a loaded weapon. If she activated the injunction too early, the automated alert systems at Harbor Dominion Bank would immediately notify the corrupt regional vice president, giving him the critical window he needed to wipe the internal servers and disappear. We needed the bank to remain completely, blissfully blind until the very last second. Simultaneously, Elena finalized a massive, highly encrypted digital intelligence packet. It contained the irrefutable proof of my parents being out of state during the supposed notarization, the forensic accounting of the stolen funds, and the clean audit of my corporate holdings. She routed the locked packet directly to the private, secure servers of the board of directors at Vesper Meridian Freight Systems. It was a dead man switch. The packet was heavily encrypted with a rolling cipher. If my mother successfully triggered her toxic media campaign with the gossip blogger, Elena would instantly transmit the decryption key to the board, completely insulating my corporate leadership position and proving I was the victim of a massive identity fraud syndicate, long before the financial press could even print a headline. Marcus, operating from his isolated terminal, deployed his final financial snare. He utilized the metadata we had gathered to establish a network of completely legal, highly sophisticated tracking algorithms across the various commercial accounts my father was using to launder the stolen capital. Marcus could not freeze the accounts without a federal warrant, but he could attach a silent, digital tripwire to every single dollar. He was patiently waiting for the exact moment Warren attempted to move the remaining funds to his political partners in the South. The second that money shifted, Marcus would have the precise routing data required to lock down their entire escape route the moment the trap sprang. The architecture of the ambush was absolutely flawless. The legal, financial, and reputational containment fields were completely operational. We were simply waiting for the targets to walk willingly into the kill zone. The sun had completely set, casting my soundproofed study into deep, heavy shadows, illuminated only by the stark white glow of the monitors. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a slow, steady breath. The physical exhaustion of the past few days was entirely gone, replaced by the hyper-focused, electric adrenaline of an impending corporate execution. My encrypted secondary mobile device vibrated sharply against the dark walnut wood of my desk. I picked it up and opened the secure messaging application. It was a direct text from Warren, confirming his attendance for the rescheduled meeting at the trustee office tomorrow morning. The first sentence was a standard, arrogant confirmation. But the second sentence made my blood run absolutely ice cold, freezing into a jagged, perfect weapon. Warren wrote that he was bringing a guest to the signing. He stated that the legal documents looked slightly dense, so he was bringing his good friend from the bank to help explain the complex technicalities and ensure the wire transfer cleared the institutional hurdles smoothly. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart beating in a slow, powerful, victorious rhythm. He was not just walking into the trap. In his blinding, catastrophic arrogance, he was personally escorting the corrupt, highly protected banking insider directly into the center of a heavily surveilled, legally binding interrogation room. The phantom executive was about to voluntarily hand himself over, with exactly 48 hours remaining until the county sheriff stood on my front steps to auction my sanctuary. The perimeter walls began to violently crack. The psychological assault my mother had engineered finally breached the public sphere. Early Tuesday morning, the notorious financial gossip blogger published a highly toxic blind item. The post did not explicitly name me, but it viciously described a supposedly self-made female chief executive officer of a major logistics empire who was secretly drowning in massive debt and facing the imminent foreclosure of her heavily publicized mega mansion. The narrative painted this anonymous executive as a complete fraud who ruthlessly neglected her aging parents while burning corporate cash on lavish personal vanities. The financial markets are built entirely on fragile perception, and the perception of my stability was suddenly shaking. By mid-morning, the stock price of Vesper Meridian Freight Systems began to experience unnatural, jittery fluctuations. It did not trigger a catastrophic crash, but the algorithmic trading bots were clearly reacting to the toxic rumors spreading through the elite networks. I could not allow the infection to reach the institutional shareholders and trigger a massive sell-off. I immediately called a highly classified, closed-door meeting with the chairman of my board. I did not give him the entire horrifying autopsy of my family betrayal. I provided a highly sanitized, legally precise fraction of the truth to maintain his absolute trust. I informed him that my identity had been heavily compromised in a sophisticated, targeted financial attack, that my primary residence was temporarily entangled in a fraudulent lien, and that I was actively working with federal and internal security teams to neutralize the threat. I needed his absolute silence and his unwavering support to hold the board steady for just a few more days. He agreed, but the intense scrutiny in his eyes told me my runway was rapidly vanishing. Simultaneously, the physical reality of the crisis accelerated. A heavily armed courier delivered the absolute final notice of public sale directly to my gate. Worse, my internal security cameras captured a wealthy, incredibly nosy neighbor slowing their luxury vehicle to a crawl, leaning out of their window, and snapping a clear, high-resolution photograph of the neon orange sign defacing my lawn. The image risk was compounding by the hour. If that photograph reached the blogger, the blind item would instantly become a front-page corporate scandal, impossible to contain. The pressure was suffocating, but I had to maintain the flawless facade of a desperate, defeated woman. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked into the heavily surveilled, secure conference room at the downtown office of my corporate trustee. Rachel Keene sat silently beside me, her briefcase resting on the polished mahogany table. The heavy glass door swung open, and Warren strode in, radiating a sickening aura of absolute victory. Judith followed closely behind, clutching a designer handbag purchased directly with my stolen capital, but my eyes immediately locked onto the third person entering the room. He was a sharply dressed, aggressively polished man in his early 50s, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than a standard teller made in an entire year. Warren clapped the man on the shoulder with exaggerated familiarity. He introduced him as Evan Lawton, the regional vice president of credit at Harbor Dominion Bank. Warren smoothly claimed Evan was simply there as a completely objective mediator, a technical advisor to ensure the multi-million-dollar wire transfer was routed perfectly, and the ugly public notice was immediately retracted without any bureaucratic friction. Evan took a seat directly across from me. He did not look like a man facilitating a warm family reconciliation. He looked like a corporate cleaner stepping into a crime scene with a heavy bucket of bleach. He leaned forward, adopting a practiced, highly empathetic tone. He quietly urged me to execute the payoff quietly and efficiently today. He promised, with a heavy, significant look, that if I wired the funds immediately, he would personally guarantee the bank handled the entire delinquency internally. He explicitly stated he would ensure the file was completely closed and never forwarded to the Internal Fraud Division or external federal regulators. It was pitched as a massive favor to protect my prestigious reputation. In reality, it was a desperate, thinly veiled attempt to permanently erase his own digital footprints and completely bury his complicity in a multi-million-dollar institutional felony. I picked up my gold pen, feigning a slightly trembling hand, preparing to execute the trap and force them to sign the damning, self-incriminating attestations Rachel had drafted. Then, the entire operation nearly imploded. Warren suddenly reached into his thick leather portfolio and slapped a single, crisp sheet of paper down onto the center of the mahogany table. My breath caught violently in my throat. It was a perfectly replicated stamped copy of the legal revocation of my medical power of attorney. The exact same document Rachel had quietly pulled from the secure digital archives just days ago. Warren leaned back, a cruel, knowing smirk twisting his features. He stated that a very helpful clerk in the county records division had alerted his political network that my legal team was actively querying historical mandates. He knew I was looking for a technical way out. He knew I was preparing to build a legal defense. There was a massive, catastrophic leak in the municipal system. In that fraction of a second, the entire illusion of my surrender shattered. Evan Lawton visibly stiffened, his eyes darting rapidly toward the door. Suddenly realizing the room felt significantly less like a negotiation and more like a carefully constructed cage. If the corrupt banking executive bolted now, the insider would vanish into the corporate machinery forever, entirely out of my reach. Before I could even react, Rachel Keene executed a brilliant, incredibly violent pivot. She slammed her hand flat against the heavy table, the sharp crack echoing loudly in the acoustic space. She shot up from her chair, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated legal fury. She began shouting, viciously accusing Warren of negotiating in spectacularly bad faith, of attempting to ambush her client with stolen legal documents. She grabbed my arm, forcibly pulling me out of my chair. She declared the mediation completely contaminated and aggressively announced we were suspending the signing for exactly 24 hours to review this new, highly hostile development. She dragged me out of the conference room, leaving Warren, Judith, and a suddenly terrified bank executive sitting in stunned silence. Rachel had deliberately blown up the preliminary meeting to prevent Warren from realizing he had just walked into a much larger snare. She shifted our entire strategy in a single heartbeat, transforming a quiet mediation trap into a devastating, explosive, on-the-spot ambush for the following morning. That night, the absolute final night before the public auction, I stood completely alone on the front porch of Stonewake Estate. The biting Virginia wind whipped around me, chilling my skin. I stared out into the heavy darkness, my eyes fixed on the ugly silhouette of the foreclosure sign planted in the grass. The sheer magnitude of the risk was completely crushing. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rose, I could easily lose my entire corporate image, waste months of agonizing litigation, and permanently hand the ultimate victory to my father. Or, if the trap held together for just a few more hours, I was going to pull the lever and watch the entire syndicate crash to the ground in one single, catastrophic blow. At exactly 8 o'clock on the morning the public auction was scheduled to execute. The atmosphere inside the secure conference room of my corporate trustee was suffocatingly thick with arrogant anticipation. The heavy mahogany table dominated the space, polished to a mirror shine under the harsh fluorescent lights. Warren, Judith, and Evan Lawton sat across from me in a tight, confident row. They looked like a victorious board of directors preparing to accept the unconditional surrender of a hostile takeover. Warren repeatedly tapped his expensive, stolen gold watch, his eyes locked onto my hands, hungrily waiting for me to pull out my secure mobile device and initiate the multi-million-dollar wire transfer. He truly believed the agonizing pressure of the impending public scandal had completely broken my resolve. I did not reach for my phone. I kept my hands resting flat and perfectly still on the cool surface of the table. Instead of a digital confirmation screen, I reached down into my heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a massive, rigorously bound legal dossier. I lifted it and dropped it squarely onto the exact center of the table. The heavy, authoritative thud echoed sharply against the acoustic paneling, shattering the comfortable silence they had been enjoying. Warren frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in sudden confusion. He reached out to touch the cover, but I immediately pulled it back an inch. "This is not a settlement agreement," I stated, my voice dropping into a register of absolute, freezing calm. "This is the complete, undeniable autopsy of your criminal syndicate." I flipped the heavy cover open. I did not give them a single second to process the shift in the room before I began verbally dismantling their entire reality. I walked them through the pristine, categorized evidence, page by devastating page. I showed them the certified legal revocation of the medical mandate, proving their foundational document was a dead, useless forgery. I laid out the updated chain of title, explicitly detailing the three-way parcel subdivision that completely nullified their claim to the primary residential estate. I revealed the digital access logs from the electronic notary, highlighting the exact Internet Protocol address tracing directly back to the secure executive servers of Harbor Dominion Bank. Finally, I turned to the forensic accounting map, tracking every single stolen dollar from their joint checking account straight into the doomed coastal resort project in Florida. Evan Lawton went absolutely rigid in his tailored suit. The arrogant, patronizing smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by the sheer, blinding terror of a man who suddenly realizes he has stepped onto a live landmine. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps construct a desperate, frantic lie, but he never got the chance. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open with violent force. It was not my executive assistant bringing a tray of morning coffee. 4 highly imposing individuals strode into the room in a tight, coordinated formation, completely changing the oxygen level in the space. The man leading the group was the Global General Counsel for Harbor Dominion Bank, a man whose entire career was dedicated to ruthlessly protecting the institution from federal indictments. Flanking him was a senior representative from the Commercial Title Insurance Underwriter, a hardened financial investigator from the State Attorney General Office, and a heavily armed federal agent attached to the White Collar Financial Crimes Division. Rachel Keene rose gracefully from her chair beside me. She did not raise her voice, but her words sliced through the frozen air like a surgical scalpel. She held up a thick stack of papers stamped with the heavy, undeniable seal of the federal court. She formally announced that a federal judge had signed an emergency injunction exactly 2 hours prior to this meeting. The order officially and permanently halted the public foreclosure auction. Furthermore, it authorized the immediate preservation of all corporate assets and issued a mandatory, unblockable subpoena for the internal, encrypted communications of the Regional Commercial Lending Division at Harbor Dominion Bank. The bank general counsel stepped forward, his face a mask of pure, concentrated, institutional fury. He completely ignored Warren and Judith, locking his eyes directly onto his corrupt vice president. He stated, in a voice loud enough for the recording devices to pick up perfectly, that the bank was actively terminating Evan Lawton effective immediately. The institution was fully cooperating with federal authorities. He publicly confirmed that the massive mortgage was illegally approved based on deliberately manipulated title data, that the mandatory physical verification protocols were intentionally bypassed, and that the legal description of the collateral on the forged deed was tied entirely to Parcel C, the worthless dirt strip by the highway. The foreclosure action against the primary estate was fundamentally, legally invalid. Evan began to hyperventilate. The polished corporate predator instantly dissolved into a pathetic, stammering mess. He threw his hands up, frantically trying to blame a massive procedural error, claiming a junior underwriter had accidentally pushed the file through the system without his final authorization. I reached out and turned the dossier to page 42. I read aloud, enunciating every single syllable, the direct, unencrypted text messages Warren had sent to Evan just days before the loan was funded. Warren had explicitly thanked Evan for manually overriding the internal title lock and for personally setting up the secure network tunnel to run the fake notary seal. The digital fingerprints were permanently burned into the bank servers. Evan slumped back into his chair, the remaining color draining completely from his face as the federal agent stepped up behind him. Then, the complete, catastrophic reality finally crashed down upon my parents. Warren violently exploded. The sophisticated, untouchable patriarch facade shattered into a million jagged pieces of pure, animalistic panic. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany wood, screaming at the general counsel, begging them to keep this a private civil matter. When that failed, he whipped his head toward me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, wildly threatening to file a massive defamation lawsuit against my company and destroy my life. Judith collapsed into a puddle of theatrical, hysterical tears. She lunged across the wide table, desperately trying to grab my hands, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking loudly against the wood. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to remember that I was their only daughter, screaming that we had to resolve this quietly within the family to protect our legacy. I calmly, coldly pulled my hands out of her frantic reach. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked up at the ceiling corners of the room. I explicitly reminded all three of them that every single threat of legal action, every desperate confession of guilt, and every pathetic plea for mercy was currently being captured from 3 different angles by state-of-the-art, legally admissible high-definition recording devices. The room fell into a sudden, horrifying, dead silence as they simultaneously realized there was absolutely no escape. The resolution was swift and utterly merciless. The bank formally withdrew the foreclosure action right there in the conference room, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The federal agent officially informed Warren, Judith, and Evan that they were the primary targets of a massive, multi-agency financial fraud and racketeering investigation. Within the hour, their multi-million-dollar accounts were completely frozen by the government. The European luxury vehicles were slated for seizure, and the massive cash deposits sitting in the failing Florida real estate project were legally locked down as proceeds of a major crime. I walked out of that downtown building having paid exactly $0 to save my property. I did not just rescue the physical bricks and mortar of Stonewake Estate. I ruthlessly, violently protected my pristine corporate reputation, shielded my massive logistics empire from a catastrophic shareholder panic, and permanently secured the absolute right to dictate my own public narrative. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, a specialized landscaping crew arrived at my private gates to rip the neon orange sign out of my front lawn. I stood silently on the expansive mahogany porch, watching them haul the ugly metal frame away into the back of a truck. The manicured grass was clear once again, but a deep, dark, ugly dent remained embedded in the soft soil. I instructed the groundskeeper to leave the damaged earth exactly as it was. It was a permanent, quiet, necessary reminder. The most dangerous, lethal threats to a carefully built empire rarely come from rival corporations or external enemies laying siege to the walls. They come from the very people standing comfortably inside your own gates, the people who look you in the eye and genuinely believe they possess the divine right to use your name as the master key to your vault. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support us even further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.